Imagine losing everything you hold dear in just one day. Your children, your wealth, your health, your reputation, all of it gone. Now picture yourself lying on the ground, body aching, heart in pieces, covered in dust and ash. Yet in that moment, a man looks up to the sky and says, "May the name of the Lord still be honored." This is Job's story. But hidden behind his suffering lies something most have never heard. A mystery runs through his pain, a truth that reaches far beyond loss, grief, or confusion. Why would someone so faithful face such intense suffering? Why did God remain silent for so long? And what did he finally say when he answered from the storm? The Bible offers clues, but the most powerful moment comes at the end, when the Creator speaks, shaking the world and changing everything. What God reveals in the whirlwind isn't just a message about endurance. It's a glimpse into who God really is, what real faith looks like, and what takes place when heaven finally speaks to human pain. Join us as we explore Job's journey, a man who lost all he had, endured God's silence, yet never let go of his faith. Learn how true belief can survive, even when it seems like heaven isn't listening. In the wide land of Uz, where the hot sun ruled the days and the land overflowed with crops and livestock, there lived a man unlike any other. His name was Job. He wasn't known just for being wealthy or successful. He lived a life that caught the eye of heaven. Job was honest, upright, and respected God deeply. He avoided evil like it was poison, and in a time when morals were fading, his life stood out like a beacon. There was no one else like him on earth, and God himself would later confirm it. Job had 10 children, 7 boys and 3 girls. His family was close-knit, and they regularly came together for feasts, joyful celebrations filled with love and unity. His daughters joined in too, and these gatherings were full of joy, abundance, and respect. Even during these happy times, Job stayed spiritually alert. After each round of feasting, he would wake early and offer sacrifices for each of his children. He would quietly think, maybe they've made a mistake or turned against God in their hearts. This ongoing concern showed the depth of his commitment. His faith wasn't just about tradition, it was real, devoted, and full of awe. Job didn't put his hope in his riches or rely on his good behavior. His trust was fully in God, and he tried to honor him even in the unseen places, like the hearts of his children. On top of that, Job was incredibly wealthy. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 pairs of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and many servants. His property was vast, his name well known, and he was considered the greatest man in all the East. But what truly made Job special wasn't all he owned, it was the purity of his soul. He was someone who lived closely with God. His name was a symbol of honesty. From a human point of view, Job's life looked flawless. He had a loving family, steady wealth, honor, respect, and a faith that couldn't be shaken. It was the kind of life many dream about, but rarely experience. Still, even with all this, Job didn't grow proud or careless. He stayed humble, always remembering that everything he owned came from God. Everything in his life seemed to be in perfect balance. His children lived in harmony, his land produced generously, his servants worked hard, and everyone in Uz looked up to him. If someone had asked back then, who is the most blessed man on earth? Most would have answered confidently, Job, the faithful one. But there was something happening that no one on earth could see. Something invisible was stirring beyond the sky. It wasn't a natural problem, like a coming famine or a new illness. It was a meeting, a divine council held high in the heavens. A conversation beyond human ears, yet one that would soon turn Job's world upside down. Even as Job offered sacrifices with deep love and care for his children, a voice was speaking before God's throne. It was a voice of accusation, a dark presence, still active today, moving through the lives of believers, searching for ways to bring harm. At that moment, while Job cared for his animals, while his children enjoyed their celebrations, and while he bowed in quiet worship, heaven was preparing for something far bigger. Job's loyalty was about to face a challenge, not because he had sinned or done wrong, but for a reason beyond human logic, a divine purpose. Job had no idea. No human ever would. But his life was becoming the focus of a heavenly debate. His calm days would soon be disturbed. His hopes would collapse. His faith would be stretched to the edge. And what was coming wasn't just grief or hardship, but a powerful truth. A story that would live on for ages and speak to hearts across generations. This is the story of a man who honored God. This is the story of Job. And as we would later learn, Job's secret wasn't in the pain he endured, but in the words spoken by God in the storm. God didn't start with explanations. He began with silence, a silence just before everything changed. For while Job was on his knees, praying for his children with a heart full of sorrow and trust, a great and hidden moment was taking place above. It was a scene no human could witness, but its impact would be felt across the earth. Scripture tells us there came a day when the heavenly beings, known as the sons of God, appeared before the Lord. And with them came Satan, the one who wanders the world, watching, questioning, and accusing. The Lord, ruler of all and wise beyond measure, began the conversation. "Where have you come from?" he asked. And Satan, with a cold tone, replied, "From traveling across the earth, walking back and forth through it." His answer wasn't just about geography. It carried a deeper meaning. He had been watching people, studying their lives, searching for flaws and hidden motives. Then, with complete confidence, God spoke a name aloud, a name that echoed between heaven and earth. "Have you noticed my servant Job?" God asked. "There's no one like him anywhere. He is honest and faithful. He honors me and stays away from evil." Satan didn't hesitate. His reply was bold, even mocking. "Is Job loyal for no reason? Haven't you surrounded him with protection, blessed his home, and made everything he does succeed? His animals fill the land? But take it all away," Satan continued, "and he will turn against you to your face." It was a direct attack on Job's sincerity. Satan was saying Job's faith was shallow, that it only existed because of the good things in his life. And in doing so, he wasn't just accusing Job, he was also questioning God. As if real devotion could only come through rewards, as if God had to buy loyalty with blessings. But then, in divine wisdom and with absolute control, God allowed the test to happen. "Fine," he said, "everything Job owns is in your hands, but do not harm him physically." With those words, a spiritual trial began that would send ripples through the earth. Satan left, now permitted to strike at everything Job had, his wealth, his servants, even his beloved children. Only Job's life was off limits. And so, a battle began, unseen to the human eye, but deeply felt in the soul. It was a test with no visible war, but with consequences that would shake a man to his core. Job was not being punished. He was being tested for his unwavering faith. A man without guilt would soon experience a flood of losses that could crush even the strongest hearts. Satan acted quickly. He came down with one goal: to prove that Job's trust in God was dependent on comfort and blessing, and he would use every form of pain to try to break him. Nothing would be spared. While Job slept, maybe dreaming of his children's smiles, his animals grazing peacefully, or another joyful meal with his family, the direction of his life quietly shifted. Heaven didn't speak, but something had changed. It wasn't because God was cruel, it was because there was a larger purpose, one that no human could yet grasp. A hidden plan that would only become clear at the end of a long road. The mystery behind Job's suffering had already begun. What God would eventually say in the whirlwind started here, in the quiet wait of a heavenly decision. God believed in Job, and now that belief would be tested, like gold passed through fire. But Job had no idea. He still gave offerings, still walked in truth, still lived as a man of integrity, but a shadow had begun to fall over his world. What began as an ordinary day was about to become the darkest moment of Job's life. It marked the start of the hardest trial ever faced by a faithful man. The morning seemed normal. The sun climbed above the hills of Uz, spreading golden light across Job's land. His workers tended the fields, the sheep roamed quietly, and his children were gathered once again at the home of the oldest brother for another joyful feast. Job, as usual, continued his peaceful habits of worship. Perhaps he was already setting things in place for the offerings he would bring the next morning, just as he always did after his children's celebrations. Everything appeared calm and under control. But Job had no idea this would be the final morning of the life he once knew. Suddenly, one of his servants came running. His face was soaked with sweat, eyes wide with fear, and his breathing was sharp and rushed, clear signs that something terrible had happened. "Master," he cried, "the oxen were working and the donkeys were nearby when the Sabians attacked. They stole the animals and killed the workers with swords. I'm the only one who escaped to bring the news." Job barely had a moment to take it in before another servant ran up, even more shaken. "Fire fell from the sky, my lord," he gasped. "It burned up all the sheep and the workers with them. Everyone is gone. I made it out alone." Job's heart was already breaking, but there was no pause. A third man appeared, trembling with fear, his eyes wide and haunted. "The Chaldeans split into 3 groups," he said quickly. "They attacked the camels and took them all. They killed every servant there. I was the only one left to tell you." It was as if the very ground had turned against him. 3 disasters back to back, each one more crushing than the last. His fortune, his work, his security, gone in an instant, and still it wasn't over. A final messenger arrived. He didn't rush in like the others. He stumbled forward, face pale, eyes brimming with sorrow. His voice cracked with emotion. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. "Your children," he finally whispered. "They were gathered at your eldest son's home." A strong wind came from the desert. It struck all 4 corners of the house. The building collapsed, and they were all inside. "No one made it out alive, my lord. They're gone. Every one of them. I'm the only one who survived." In that moment, Job's entire world collapsed. No prayer, no sacrifice, no moment of devotion could ease the weight of such heartbreak. Job had lost everything, his workers, his riches, his way of life. And now his children, 10 sons and daughters, each one a symbol of his joy, his hope, and his future, were gone. Everything was gone in a single day. The pain didn't arrive in waves. It struck like a landslide, an unstoppable force, a violent storm that wiped everything away. Nothing was left. And Job, the most faithful man alive, the one who honored God with all his heart, collapsed to the ground. He tore his robe, a deep gesture of mourning. He covered his head with ashes, showing total sorrow and humility. But what he did next stunned both heaven and earth. Job worshipped. Yes, surrounded by ruins and heartbreak, he bowed low and praised God. "I came into this world with nothing, and I'll leave it the same way. The Lord gave me everything I had, and now He's taken it away. May His name still be praised." Job didn't curse. He didn't blame anyone. He didn't accuse God of doing wrong. His riches were gone, his workers were gone, his children were gone, but his faith remained, hurt, but alive. And far above in the unseen world, Satan watched closely. The first strike hadn't shattered Job. He had endured it, but the battle wasn't finished. The storm was just beginning. The full story was still waiting to unfold, and something even more painful was already being prepared. Would Job keep trusting God, and for how long? Before we go on, we'd love your support. Please subscribe and like the video. It helps us continue sharing these powerful biblical stories. Now, let's go deeper into the sorrow, the struggle, and the still hidden truth behind Job's pain. The final messenger had left, but his words still hung in the air as though grief itself refused to let go. The silence that followed was heavy, so heavy it felt like stone pressing down. It filled everything around Job. There were no more voices, no shouts, no servants working, no animals making noise. Only the wind moved, brushing softly against the walls of a house that once rang with laughter, a house now filled only with memories. Job didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, almost as if he was searching the dirt for meaning. But there was no answer. Only the dust beneath him, the ashes on his skin, and the emptiness around him. The emptiness left by his children, the emptiness left by his servants, the absence of everything that had once filled his life with joy and purpose. In just a few short hours, it was all gone. And with that loss, something inside Job began to shift. Not his belief in God, but the emotional strength that had held him together. He stood up slowly, as though the weight of grief pressed against every bone. His steps were unsteady, as if the very ground beneath him, once a place of comfort, had crumbled under the sorrow. With shaking hands, he gripped his robe and tore it straight down the front. It was a sacred act of mourning, an ancient way to show what the heart was too broken to say. Then he lowered himself to his knees. He reached down, took a handful of ashes from the earth, and let them fall over his head. Ashes, the sign of what's been destroyed, of what has burned beyond repair, of what human strength can never bring back. The man once known as the greatest in the East was now a quiet figure in the dust, bent low and covered in sorrow. And yet, right there, on that hard, dirt-covered ground, surrounded by silence and heartache, Job did something completely unexpected. He bowed. Not in hopelessness, but in honor. Yes, in worship. He lowered himself before God and worshipped. With a voice torn by grief, but filled with deep respect, he spoke words that would echo far beyond his own time, words that would reach the hearts of all who've ever faced pain. I came into this world with nothing, and I'll leave it the same way. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May his name still be praised. Job 1:21. But these weren't just words. They were an act of surrender. Job didn't speak like a man giving in to fate. He spoke like someone who understood that God is still God, even when everything else is gone. His faith didn't rest on blessings, but on God himself. This is the kind of faith that stuns the enemy and draws the gaze of heaven, a faith that doesn't ask for answers, a faith that still lifts praise when everything else has fallen silent. Job didn't complain, he didn't argue, he didn't blame God, he worshipped. That's why the scriptures say, through all of this, Job did not sin or accuse God of doing wrong. Job 1:22. In the heavenly realm, the angels watched in amazement. God's throne received praise unlike any other, praise that rose from a place of pain. And the accuser, who had wagered on Job's collapse, now saw a man surrounded by ash and sorrow, yet still unshaken in his soul. The secret behind Job's suffering was still hidden, locked away in the divine. But something had begun to form, shaped in the heat of testing. It was a truth too deep to be explained, a truth that had to be lived, page by page, through the heart. Job had no idea what was unfolding in the heavens above. He didn't know about the meeting in heaven or the challenge made in his name. All Job knew was the fire in his chest and the faith that held firm through the storm. For most, this would have marked the end. But for Job, it was just the beginning. Because even though the enemy had failed to shake his faith through loss, he wasn't finished. He planned to push further. If taking Job's children and wealth wasn't enough, he would now strike Job's own flesh. There would be another heavenly gathering, another permission granted, another wound to bear. Job's trial had only just begun. While he still sat in the dust, covered in ashes, reeling from all he had lost, a new scene unfolded above. Once more the sons of God, heavenly beings, stood before the Lord, and again Satan was among them. God, who sees and knows everything, didn't need an update. Still, he asked, "Where have you been?" And Satan replied, just like before, from traveling around the earth, walking back and forth through it. Then the Lord spoke of Job once more, his voice filled with pride. "Have you seen my servant Job? There is no one like him on earth, blameless, upright, faithful, avoiding evil. And even now, he holds on to his integrity, even though you pushed me to let you harm him without cause." Satan answered with scorn, "A man will give anything to save his own skin. Take away his health, touch his flesh and bones, and he'll curse you to your face." It was a new accusation. The enemy admitted Job had passed the test of loss, but he was convinced that if Job were attacked physically, if he were drowning in pain, he would finally break and turn against God. And again, the Lord allowed it. "Fine," he said, "he's in your hands, but you must not take his life." With that, Satan descended in fury, wasting no time. Suddenly Job's body was overtaken by suffering. Painful sores broke out over his skin. Open wounds spread from head to foot. The itching was unbearable. His skin became infected. The odor of rotting flesh filled the air. Job, the man once admired above all others in the East, was now unrecognizable, a picture of agony. Unable to stay indoors, he left the house and sat in the ashes, among the ruins of what used to be his life. He picked up a shard of broken pottery and used it to scratch the sores, searching for some relief from the constant pain. The scene was heartbreaking. A body destroyed, a soul already torn apart, a mind grasping for meaning, and then, in that most fragile moment, a voice reached him, one he did not expect. It was the voice of his wife. She came closer, and seeing Job in such a terrible state, could no longer hold back her grief. What stood before her wasn't just a man in pain, it was the complete breakdown of everything she had believed in. "Are you still clinging to your integrity?" she cried. "Just curse God and die." Her words cut deep, sharp, and fierce, but they weren't spoken only in anger. They were the cry of someone broken, someone who could no longer bear watching the person she loved suffer. Maybe it was despair itself speaking through her mouth, but the blow was harsh. In the moment Job needed comfort most, what he received instead was a push toward giving up. Yet even then, in the face of rejection, pain, and silence, Job stood firm. "You're speaking like someone without understanding," he replied. "Should we accept good from God and not also accept hardship?" Job 2:10. Job didn't curse. He didn't revolt. He didn't turn away from God. He understood that his character wasn't tied to blessings. Though his body was broken, his soul stayed grounded in the Lord. Heaven still watched him closely. The secret behind Job's story had not yet been revealed, But each moment of pain brought him closer to the day God would speak. Job was still breathing, wounded but alive, and more than that, still faithful. But now his pain was about to change shape. Not physical but hidden, quiet and unseen. His body had already been ruined, but what came next would go even deeper. Loneliness and judgment. 3 friends were on their way. They didn't come to heal, but to question. His body had been torn apart, but now his heart would be targeted. Job was still sitting there, in the dust and ashes, his skin covered in sores, his soul aching from loss. The pain never left him, but the silence around him seemed to grow heavier with each moment. The wind blew through the ruins, carrying with it the smell of sickness and the dry air of sorrow. It was hard to believe this broken man had once been known as the greatest in all the East. News of what happened had spread. And when it reached the ears of his closest companions, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they made plans to visit Job. The trip wasn't easy. Each of them came from a different land, and their goal was clear: to comfort and support their friend through his pain. But nothing could have prepared them for what they saw. From a distance, as they approached the land of Uz, they noticed a small, hunched figure covered in dust and shadows. For a moment, they weren't even sure it was him. The figure before them was so altered, so far from the man they had once known, that it was hard to believe it was truly Job. When they realized it was him, they were overwhelmed with emotion. Their cries pierced the air as they tore their robes in grief and poured dust over their heads. This pain wasn't only Job's, it had become theirs too. Faced with such misery, words felt powerless. So they did the only thing they could. They sat down beside him right there on the ground and stayed. 7 full days and 7 long nights passed without a single word spoken. The silence was thick, filled with reverence, but also with unease. They were witnessing greatness brought low, a life reduced to ashes, a man of integrity left in ruins. And they couldn't make sense of it. No reason seemed to fit. No explanation felt right. In the presence of such raw pain, even comfort felt fragile. During those days, Job barely moved. He scratched at his sores, sometimes groaned from the pain. His eyes were unfocused, locked on nothing, as if his mind drifted between fading memories and questions with no answers. Maybe he was remembering his children's laughter, his wife beside him, the peace that once filled his home. Now it all felt far away, like a dream that disappears after waking. His friend's silence wasn't a sign of rejection. It was the quiet of people stunned by another's suffering. But slowly, it also became the silence of people beginning to analyze. And as we'll see later, they would go too far. They watched Job and started to wonder. Their minds, limited and human, began forming opinions, trying to explain what had happened. What could make a man like Job fall so low? For now, they said nothing, but their thoughts were loud. Job felt it all. Even in the quiet, he could sense the weight of their eyes. He knew they were friends, but he also knew their silence had started to shift, from sympathy to suspicion. It felt like his suffering was being studied, broken down, questioned. And during those 7 days, the deepest wound Job carried was no longer physical. It was inside, in his heart. Heaven stayed quiet. His friends said nothing. God did not appear. And Job's spirit was empty. No answers, no relief, just endless questions. So many questions. Why God? What did I do wrong? Why such punishment without reason? The pain in his body was unbearable, but the silence was worse. It echoed in his soul like an unending void. For 7 days he stared into nothing, searching for a reason, longing for a voice from above. And then, at last, something shifted. On the 8th day, Job broke the silence. But what he spoke wasn't a calm greeting or a gentle sigh. It was a cry from deep within, a scream of anguish, a release of pain that had been buried for too long. He didn't curse God, he never would, but he did curse the day he entered the world. Then the words began to spill out, words from a heart torn open, from a man who still believed but could no longer carry the weight of his sorrow in silence. At last, Job spoke, and with that, the silence shattered, not with quiet reflection, but with a raw cry rising from deep within his soul. After 7 days of silence, he opened his mouth, not to argue, and not to search for comfort, but to release the storm of pain that had built up inside him. Job didn't blame God. He didn't speak with anger toward heaven, but his words revealed a man drowning in sorrow, unable to find meaning in his own existence. "Let the day I was born be lost," he said, and the night they said, "It's a boy." It was a plea to erase his beginning. Job didn't just wish to die. He wished he had never lived. He longed to have his birthday erased from time, that the night his life began had never come to pass. This wasn't rebellion, it was despair. A soul overwhelmed by pain so deep he couldn't see through it. He couldn't understand. How could a man who had always chosen justice, who honored God in everything, be crushed like this? He asked, "Why wasn't I stillborn? Why didn't I die when I left the womb?" It was an honest outcry. He wasn't condemning the one who made him. He was questioning his very beginning. Each sentence was like a breath of grief finally allowed to escape. Job no longer wanted to live. He saw no reason to go on. To him, life had become empty. In his words, he painted death as a kind of peace, a quiet place where pain could no longer reach. He spoke of rulers and kings, of counselors and servants, even of the enslaved, all resting together in the grave. There, he said, the cruel stop causing harm, and the tired finally find rest. Job's sorrow had reached such depths that even the silence of the tomb sounded better than another day alive. "Why is life given to those in misery?" he cried. "Why must those filled with sorrow continue to exist?" With these words, Job stepped beyond his own tragedy. He began to ask the bigger questions. Why allow someone to be born if their life will only be filled with tears? Why give breath to a soul when all it feels is pain? He didn't know it then, but these words would travel through centuries, because every human heart at some point wrestles with despair. And Job's cry shows that even the most faithful can be swallowed by sorrow. That feeling pain isn't proof of guilt, it's proof of being human. He closed his speech with an image burned into his being. "My sighs are all I have to eat. My groans flow like water." Job was overwhelmed by fear, anxiety, and confusion. "What I feared most has come true," he said. "What I dreaded has happened. I have no peace, no calm, no rest, only chaos." His words came from a place of deep sorrow, a heart trying to make sense of how his worst fears had all come to life. He didn't know it, but this moment was part of the journey, because before God could speak, Job had to pour everything out. And in that emptying, the most honest parts of his soul began to rise. With each word, Job cleared space inside himself for something greater, something divine. Every layer of pride, strength, and comfort had to be stripped away, so only the core of who he was would remain. Then, after that raw cry from the depths of his being, his friends finally stood to speak. They had stayed silent for 7 days. But now, whether they felt prepared or simply assumed they had answers, they opened their mouths. And what started as support quickly turned into something else: accusation. After Job's outburst of grief, the silence was broken by Eliphaz the Temanite. He was the first to speak. His tone was gentle, even respectful at first. But his words carried judgment, hidden beneath the surface, like a dagger wrapped in soft cloth. "If someone speaks to you, will you be upset?" he asked. But who could stay silent? Eliphaz reminded Job that he had once been the one who gave strength to others, encouraged the weak, and offered advice to those in need. But now that suffering had come to him, he stumbled. The message was clear. You were quick to guide others, but now you can't follow your own wisdom. Then came his first accusation, still subtle but present. "Think about it," he said. "When has an innocent person ever been destroyed? When have the righteous truly been wiped out?" Eliphaz was suggesting that Job must have done something wrong, because in his mind, suffering was always linked to sin. This was the belief they held tightly to, that good people are always blessed, and only the guilty experience pain. He even shared a strange vision he claimed to have seen at night, something mysterious and frightening. In it, he said no one is truly righteous before God. Not even angels are pure in his eyes. God doesn't even trust his servants, Eliphaz declared, and he finds fault even in his angels. By saying this, he implied Job had no right to defend himself, as if he were asking, "Who are you to think you're innocent before God?" In the next part of his speech, Eliphaz shifted from calm advice to stronger words. He said those who suffer do so because they reject God's correction. He insisted that punishment was a form of divine discipline, and then he offered a promise: if Job would just submit to God, he would be restored. "Blessed is the one God corrects," he said, "so don't ignore the discipline of the Almighty." Under different circumstances, those words might have sounded wise. But for a man who had lost everything without reason, who sat in ashes, covered in sores, unable to find any fault in himself, they felt like pouring salt on open wounds. Eliphaz didn't bring comfort. He brought judgment. He spoke from what he saw, based on human logic, assumptions, and outward appearances. What he couldn't see was that Job's pain came from something far greater, a test sent from above, beyond the usual rules of cause and effect. Words meant to soothe became weapons. Job, already crushed, now had to carry the added weight of being accused. The support he longed for from his friends had become another form of pain. On top of the physical suffering and emotional grief, Job now felt the ache of being misunderstood. The very people who came to help him only deepened the wound. Still, Job didn't lose his voice. He listened to Eliphaz. He stayed silent, but his heart burned inside him. He knew his pain wasn't because of some secret sin. He knew he had walked in truth before God, and for that reason, he wouldn't stay quiet. Beneath the false accusations, the flawed advice, and the attempts to explain what couldn't be explained, Job still had something to say. He couldn't stay silent. He had to speak. He had listened to every word Eliphaz said, every hint, every spiritual argument coated with judgment. And when Job finally responded, he didn't speak with rage, but with sorrow. A sorrow born not only from loss, but from being misread by those he trusted. "If only my sadness could be weighed," he said. "If my suffering could be placed on scales, it would be heavier than all the sand on earth." He began with honesty, acknowledging the depth of his pain. He didn't beg for sympathy, but for understanding. His sorrow was too massive to measure. What wounded him most wasn't just what he had lost, but that his friends, instead of offering kindness, chose to accuse. "A man in despair," he said, "still deserves loyalty from his friends, even if he has turned from God." It was both a gentle plea and a sharp truth. Job was saying, even if he had walked away from God, though he hadn't, he still should have been treated with care. Instead, they came with cold beliefs and rigid ideas, acting as if spiritual formulas could fix what he was feeling. He compared their words to a dried river, promising water but leaving travelers thirsty. He had come to them hoping for comfort, but they had failed him. Then Job turned his heart toward God. He still honored God's power, but he also spoke his confusion. "What is man, that you pay so much attention to him, that you examine him so closely?" This wasn't a question from curiosity, it was one of deep pain. Why would a great God watch someone so small? Why track his steps? Why allow such suffering? Why test him so harshly? And then came the most honest cry of all. "If I've done wrong, what have I done to you, the one who sees all things? Why have you made me your target?" Job cried. He couldn't make sense of it. He never claimed to be without fault, but he couldn't find any sin in himself great enough to deserve this kind of pain. It felt like he was being punished for reasons he didn't understand. He poured out his heart before God. But Job didn't stop there. He pressed forward, now speaking with even more courage, challenging the logic his friends had built their arguments on. "Yes, I know what you're saying is technically true," he said, "but how can anyone prove themselves innocent before God?" Job admitted that no one can claim to be perfect before the Almighty. He understood that God's power is limitless. God can shake the earth, cover the stars, stretch the heavens, all things too vast for the human mind to grasp. Still, Job deeply longed for a chance to state his case. He wished for someone who could stand between him and God, someone who could help him understand the purpose behind his pain. "If only I knew where to find him," Job said. "If only I could go to his dwelling." Yet, even in the confusion and spiritual fog, Job's trust in God remained shockingly strong. Wounded, rejected, and full of questions, still he believed. And then, in one of his most powerful declarations, he said, "Even if he kills me, I will still put my hope in him." That one line showed that Job's faith wasn't based on blessings or comfort. He was saying, even if God takes everything, even my life, I will still trust him. A belief that doesn't rely on answers, that survives when heaven is quiet. That holds firm even when nothing is certain. But the accusations hadn't ended, and Job knew it. His words fell into the silence like stones in deep water, but instead of bringing reflection, they stirred up fresh arguments. What should have been a discussion turned into a trial, and Job's wounds were the evidence. While God had not yet answered, the pain dragged on. The speeches grew longer, the sorrow deeper. His friend's judgment would continue, growing sharper with every word. Even though Job spoke with honesty and depth, his pain didn't soften their hearts. Instead, it triggered even harsher responses. The second friend, Bildad, didn't bother with kindness or caution. His tone was direct and cutting. If Job was suffering, he must have done wrong, and likely so had his children. "How long are you going to keep saying these things?" Bildad asked. "Your words are nothing but hot air." To him, Job's speech wasn't meaningful. It was noise, wind, blowing without purpose. To Bildad, God was always just. He never twisted fairness. So if Job's children had died, it had to be because they were guilty. And if Job was now suffering, the only answer in Bildad's eyes was to seek God with sincerity, which to him meant admitting to hidden wrongdoing. "If you're truly pure and honest," he said, "then even now God will rise to defend you and restore your life to what it once was." Bildad's thinking followed a strict formula. God blesses the righteous and punishes the guilty. So if Job was in misery, it had to be his own doing, and if he wasn't confessing, it must have been pride. Job heard him and answered again. His heart aching, he cried out once more. He never challenged God's justice, but he couldn't find anything in himself that could justify the pain he was living through. So he lifted his voice to the heavens again, not in complaint, but in desperation. "You know I haven't done wrong. There's no one who can save me from your hand." He wondered why God had taken such care to create him, like a potter carefully shaping clay, only to now break him into pieces. Where was the kindness? Where was the purpose? But before anyone could offer compassion, the third friend spoke. Zophar. And with him, the judgment reached a new level. Zophar was the harshest of them all. He told Job that he talked too much, that his words meant nothing, and that if God were truly fair, Job would be suffering even more than he already was. Zophar declared, "I wish God would speak up and rebuke you himself. Just so you know, he's already overlooked some of your sin." His words were brutal. Zophar didn't just assume Job was guilty. He claimed Job deserved worse. And like the others, he dangled the same offer. If Job would just repent, everything would go back to normal. But Job had nothing to confess. He knew his heart was clean before God. And so the cycle began again. Eliphaz returned with more arguments, then Bildad, then Zophar. Again and again they spoke, each taking turns passing judgment like judges in a court without truth. They quoted wise sayings, traditions, things they'd seen in life. They spoke about how wicked people fall, how the righteous are lifted up, how God humbles the proud and honors the lowly. But no matter how they dressed it up, the message was always the same. "Job, you must have done something. Admit it." Their thinking never changed. In their minds, suffering always meant guilt. But they were wrong, because their logic never reached heaven. What was happening to Job wasn't a punishment. It was a purpose. This story was never about guilt. It was about trust. As Job became more broken within, he began to step away from the arguments of men. He realized their words held no justice, no comfort, so he began to call out for something beyond them. "I know that my Redeemer lives, and in the end he will stand upon the earth." These words came from a faith that refused to die. While his friends hurled accusations without compassion, Job raised his voice with certainty. He believed that someone, his Redeemer, would come to his defense. Someone far beyond their limited understanding, beyond their dry beliefs, beyond their judgments. It was as if Job was saying, "You may not understand me, but God does, and he will answer." By now, Job had stopped expecting answers from people. He longed for something more, something greater than words, something that would break the silence from above. Worn down and tired, Job cried out, not from pain in his body or grief over his children, but from exhaustion with the shallow logic of his friends. He had heard enough of their cold advice, enough of their spiritual speeches pretending to be comfort, enough of their insistence that he must be hiding some secret sin. But Job knew he had walked with integrity. His heart was still clear before God. So after yet another round of criticism, Job spoke again, but this time not to them. His voice rose upward. It wasn't a traditional prayer, it was a cry, a plea for justice. "Listen closely to my words," he said. "Let that be your kindness to me." All he wanted was to be heard. Just once he wanted them to stop preaching and start listening. And then Job began to tear down their theology with the truth he saw around him. "Why do the wicked go on living?" he asked. "Why do they grow old and grow stronger?" It was a question that cut through all their easy answers. Job looked at the world and saw that those who did evil often thrived. He saw corrupt people living in peace, building wealth, raising families in safety. They laughed at God, and still they seemed to flourish. Their homes stood secure. Their livestock increased. So where was this instant justice his friends kept preaching? They say to God, "Leave us alone. We don't want to know your ways." And yet they continued to succeed. Even as they pushed God away, their lives were full. Job couldn't make sense of it. He had lived in honesty, offered sacrifices, served God, and his world had been torn apart. While those who ignored God seemed to enjoy everything he had lost. How could anyone explain that? The logic his friends clung to fell apart in the face of what Job had seen. Does God judge each person right away? Are the wicked always punished? Are the righteous always protected? These were the burning questions in Job's heart. He wasn't trying to provoke or rebel. He just wanted to understand. His cry didn't come from defiance. It came from a wounded faith, one brave enough to ask because it still believed. Job's trust in God was unlike that of his friends. They weren't searching, they were quoting. He, on the other hand, wasn't trying to defend God with perfect-sounding phrases. He was trying to find him. He longed to speak to God, to stand before him if possible, look into his face and say, "Here I am. Answer me, show me why." "Oh, if only I knew where to find him," Job said. "If only I could go straight to where he sits." That cry is one of the most honest expressions of longing in all of Scripture. Job yearned for a meeting with God. He wanted to lay his heart out like a case in court, not to accuse, but to understand. I would explain my side to him, I'd speak my heart, and then I would listen to what he says in return. Job wasn't trying to win an argument, he just wanted clarity. What hurt most wasn't just the pain, it was the silence, the absence of a reply from heaven. If I go east, he's not there. If I go west, I can't find him. If he's working in the north, I don't see him. If he moves south, he disappears from sight. God seemed everywhere, and yet nowhere. Job searched, but God remained hidden. Still, in the middle of his confusion and pain, Job declared, "But he knows the road I walk, and when he has tested me, I'll come out as pure gold." Once again, that unshakable faith shined through. Job didn't understand the reason for his trial, but he believed in the one allowing it. He knew this suffering had meaning, that something good would come from it, even if he didn't yet know what. He kept speaking, describing how wicked people oppress the poor, take advantage of the weak, and carry out evil in secret. Job saw the injustice all around him and what felt like delay from heaven, and that troubled him deeply. "Why doesn't the Almighty set clear times for judgment?" he asked. "Why must those who know him wait in vain to see justice done? Why doesn't God give obvious signs to his people? Why the silence? Why the long delay?" Job hadn't yet heard the voice he was so desperate for. His friends kept throwing blame. Heaven had not responded, and God still remained silent. God's silence still hovered over everything. Job had emptied his heart, spoken every sorrow, asked every question. His friends had responded with strong words, speech after speech, filled with what sounded like wisdom, but only pushed Job deeper into despair. And then, at last, the argument stopped. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar went quiet. They had nothing more to say. They couldn't change Job's mind, and they had run out of ways to accuse him. Job, for his part, no longer paid much attention to them. He was drained, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and in that quiet moment, between grief and exhaustion, a new voice emerged. His name was Elihu. Until now, he had said nothing. He introduced himself as a younger man, one who had waited out of respect for his elders. But now, stirred by a deep, holy urgency, he could stay silent no longer. "I'm young and you are older," he said. "That's why I held back and didn't speak." Elihu spoke humbly, but with boldness. He claimed that it's not age that brings wisdom, but the spirit God breathes into a person. True understanding comes from the breath of the Almighty. He didn't speak to Job first. He turned to the three friends. He called them out. He told them that despite all their long speeches, they had failed to prove anything. They hadn't truly answered Job. Worse still, they had tried to condemn him without real evidence. "None of you has silenced Job," Elihu said, "and yet you accuse him as if you've won." Then he turned to Job. His tone was firm, but not harsh. He brought up something the others had missed entirely, that suffering might have a different purpose, not to punish, but to shape. "Why do you say God doesn't respond?" Elihu asked. "He does speak to people, through dreams, through visions, even through pain, but not always in the ways we expect. God's voice might not thunder from the sky, but he speaks, now one way, now another, and people often miss it." Elihu didn't accuse Job of great sin like the others had. Instead, he offered a new perspective. If God allows suffering, it is not meaningless. It could be to guide, to protect, to reveal something more. Pain might not be punishment, it might be process. Elihu lifted up the greatness of God. He said, "The Lord is full of wisdom, flawless in knowledge, and that no one can truly challenge him." But he also made one thing clear: God does not reject humanity. Even when correcting, he desires good for us. "God is powerful," Elihu said, "but he looks down on no one. His strength is matched by purpose." Elihu was trying to show that God is not cold or distant in our pain. He is sovereign, yes, but also near. And maybe, just maybe, Job's suffering was not God turning away, but an invitation to come closer and see more than ever before. How vast is God, far beyond what we can grasp. His years are countless, his understanding without limit. Throughout his speech, Elihu pointed to creation to make his case. He spoke of clouds, of thunder, of rain. He urged Job to lift his eyes to the skies and see the wonder above. "Look at all this," he seemed to say. "Look at how little we truly understand, and yet we live under these mysteries every day." It was as if Elihu was telling Job, maybe God won't explain everything now, but that doesn't mean he isn't working. Even when you don't understand, trust him. Elihu didn't give exact answers, but he offered something better: hope. A quiet hope, wrapped in reverence and humility, but also filled with confidence. His words didn't cut. They stirred something awake. They were clear, but never cruel. Honest, but never harsh. Elihu wasn't trying to win an argument. He simply pointed to God, not as a harsh judge, but as a wise teacher. And near the end of his speech he said, "The Almighty is beyond our reach and exalted in strength. In his justice and righteousness, he does not do wrong." He finished with awe, lifting God to his rightful place, above all, beyond all, yet always just. It was an invitation, quietly calling Job to see God not only as sovereign, but as something far greater than human understanding could ever explain. The air seemed to change. Elihu's words remained in the silence like the moment just before something big begins. Heaven had not yet spoken, but that was about to change. Because after the young man's final words, after the last human voice had gone quiet, the wind rose, and when it cleared, the whirlwind had arrived. The sky darkened. After countless chapters filled with sorrow, accusations, and unanswered questions, the silence shattered, not with more human reasoning, not with a new opinion, but with something completely unexpected. A storm formed on the edge of the horizon, but this was no ordinary storm. This wind carried power. It carried majesty. It brought awe. The sky moved with purpose, as if creation itself was rising to attention. Lightning cracked across the clouds. The wind roared through the stones. The earth rumbled underfoot, and then God spoke. The Lord spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. From the heart of the storm came the voice of the Almighty. It was as if all of creation bowed before him. There was no more room for debates, no more space for theories. God had arrived. But what he said surprised everyone. He didn't begin with comfort. He didn't explain Job's suffering. He didn't pull back the curtain to reveal the heavenly test. Instead, he asked a question. Who is this that speaks without knowledge, darkening my counsel? It wasn't harsh or angry, but it was direct. A correction, spoken with divine authority. God wasn't accusing Job of wrongdoing. He was showing him that his view was too small. He spoke as the one who sees the entire picture, while humans only catch glimpses. Stand tall like a man. I will ask, and you will answer. And from that moment, a flood of questions poured down on Job. Questions filled with the weight of eternal wisdom. But they weren't meant to be answered. They weren't tests. They were revelations. They were meant to remind Job, and all of us, of the vastness of God and the limits of man. Where were you when I set the earth's foundation? Tell me if you have understanding. Each line came with the power of creation itself. God spoke of the earth's size, its structure, the way the oceans were placed. He described the sunrise, the depths of the sea, the boundary between light and dark. Have you ever traveled to the springs of the sea? Have you explored the deepest places of the earth? It was as if God was peeling back the curtain of existence, not to scold, but to invite Job to see something more. Not to focus only on suffering, but on the wonder that holds the universe together. He described the storehouses of snow, the constellations scattered across the sky, the invisible laws that govern the stars. Name after name, image after image, God lifted up his work, not in pride, but to stir awe. He talked of rain that waters the deserts where no one walks, of ravens crying out for food, of mountain goats giving birth in hidden cliffs, of wild oxen that no man can tame, of ostriches that abandon their eggs, of war horses that leap into battle, of hawks that soar toward the sky. Every detail held meaning. Do you understand these things, Job? Can you explain them? This wasn't meant to shame. It was meant to awaken. God didn't respond to Job's pain with explanations. He responded with himself. He didn't answer why the suffering came. He answered with who he is. And with that, the weight of Job's sorrow began to shift. Not because the pain disappeared, but because it was now wrapped inside something far greater, divine glory. Job had heard many voices. His friends spoke with judgment. Elihu spoke with passion. But the voice in the whirlwind, this voice, spoke with majesty. Through every question, the Creator was painting a new way to see everything: life, humanity, faith. In that storm of thunder and wisdom, Job didn't get all the answers he asked for. He received something more lasting, the understanding that God remains in control even when the world breaks apart. That real faith doesn't depend on reasons. It depends on surrender. The storm still swirled around Job, but something inside him had begun to grow quiet. The wind howled, the whirlwind spun, but peace was beginning to rise. God's voice continued to rise from the whirlwind, but now it was more than a display of strength. It became a revelation. What Job heard wasn't just a response, it was a call to witness something far beyond human understanding. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? That question wasn't just the start of an answer. It was the gateway to a journey, one that led Job to a single destination: humility in the presence of God's glory. God didn't mention the conversation with Satan. He never explained why Job had suffered. He didn't speak of tests or divine arrangements, but he gave Job exactly what he needed: himself. He pointed to the stars in the sky, the laws of heaven, the cycles of rain, frost, and dew. Then he spoke of animals, each one unique, wild, purposeful: the lion and the raven, the mountain goat, the wild donkey, the ox that cannot be tamed, the ostrich that forgets her eggs, the battle-ready horse, the soaring hawk, and the mighty crocodile. Each creature told a story. Each detail whispered a truth. God is present in all things, and all things rest under his care. Who gave the heart its wisdom? God asked. Who gave understanding to the mind? It was as if the Creator was saying, Job, you won't understand it all, but you don't need to. What you need is to trust me. The never-revealed secret of Job, the words spoken in the whirlwind, were not explanations. They were revelations. God doesn't owe man a report. He is God, sovereign, flawless, eternal. And we, like clay in his hands, were made to trust, not demand. But here's what makes that truth beautiful. It doesn't crush, it transforms. It doesn't push humanity down to break us. It places us where we belong, beneath God, so we can finally see rightly, with awe and trust. Job stood in the presence of something no other man had experienced like this, a conversation with the Creator of the universe. Not a moment for answers, a moment to be reshaped. Then God asked, "Will the one who argues with the Almighty correct him?" And Job, who had once demanded explanations, began to speak again. But this time everything had changed. There was no more pleading, no more defense, no more search for fairness. He said, "I am nothing. What can I possibly say? I'll put my hand over my mouth." Job had begun to see. His grief remained. His losses were still real, but something inside him had shifted. He no longer needed all the answers. He now knew the one who held them. But God wasn't done. He continued to speak, describing Behemoth and Leviathan, massive, fearsome, untamable creatures, strong beyond human power, frightening in their presence. And yet, they lived under the eyes of their Maker. His breath sets coals ablaze, God said. Fire bursts from his mouth. In the end, the message was unmistakable. If Job couldn't tame or even understand the wild creatures God described, how could he begin to judge the ways of the Creator? Job had cried out, begged, and questioned, and God had answered, not with explanations, but with his presence. The climax of Job's journey wasn't a solution. It was a transformation within. The secret that had never been told was this: God does not owe anyone an explanation. He calls us to worship, not to figure him out. And real faith is the kind that bows, even when it doesn't have the full picture. Job's belief had been pushed to its limit. He had lost everything. His body was broken, his soul crushed. His friends had turned on him. And now, in the whirlwind, he didn't find the end of pain. He found the beginning of perspective. This was the secret that had remained hidden. What God spoke to Job in the storm was that life isn't sustained by answers, but by trust. And when seen through the lens of God's glory, even suffering begins to make sense. So what did Job say after everything? The storm was over. The whirlwind that once carried God's voice now faded, leaving behind not emptiness, but reverence. A stillness rich with meaning, where silence said more than words. Job, the man who had spoken so many words, now simply bowed. No more defenses, no more demands, not even cries of sorrow, just surrender. I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be stopped. Job 42, verse 2. These were Job's first words after hearing the voice of the Almighty. And they weren't the words of a broken man. They were the words of someone restored on the inside. His wounds had not vanished. His grief still lingered. But now, that pain lived within a heart reshaped by something far greater than human reasoning, the presence of God. "I had only heard of you before," he said, "but now my eyes have seen you." Those words capture the soul of the entire story. Job, the righteous, faithful man, had come to know God in a completely different way. Not through routine, tradition, or blessings. He had seen God, not with physical sight, but with the eyes of the heart, a heart awakened by divine encounter. This was the true transformation, to see God in the middle of pain. Job confessed his limits. He admitted that he had spoken of things too wonderful for him, things he couldn't understand. And now he bowed in repentance, not for moral failure, but for trying to fit God inside human understanding. "Therefore I take back my words and repent in dust and ashes." And there, right in the ashes where he once mourned and wept, Job bowed again. Not because he cried out in pain, but because he had demanded to understand what was meant to be trusted. And it was at that very moment of surrender, when Job let go of control, that the path to restoration began. Then God turned his attention to Job's friends. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, men who had spoken with confidence, but without compassion. They had wrongly accused Job, assuming guilt where there was none. And now, God confronted them directly. "My anger burns against you and your two companions," the Lord said, "because you did not speak truthfully about me as my servant Job did." In a stunning moment, God defends Job. Even after all the pain, all the questions, and all the cries for justice, God affirms Job's honesty. His complaints were not rebellion. His sorrow wasn't sin. It was sincere. And to God, that raw sincerity meant more than polished arguments lacking love. God then commanded the friends to offer sacrifices for atonement. But that wasn't enough. They would need Job, the very man they had wounded, to pray for them. Yes, the one they falsely accused would now become the one who stood in the gap for them. "My servant Job will pray for you," God said, "and I will listen to him." And Job, with a humbled heart, did just that. He prayed for the very people who had caused him pain. This moment is just as powerful as the whirlwind itself. The man who was once broken was now the one who brought healing. The one who had sat alone in ashes now offered mercy in intercession. And it was precisely in that moment, when Job prayed for those who had hurt him, that something incredible happened. The Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed for his friends. The tide turned. God reversed the suffering. He rewrote the ending. He gave Job back all that had been lost, and even more. Everything that had been taken, his wealth, his herds, his honor, was returned in abundance. He had more children, lived many more years, and saw 4 generations after him. But more important than any of these blessings, Job saw God. That was the secret hidden all along. What God had said in the whirlwind wasn't an explanation. It was an invitation to see. Job's pain had led him into something deeper, a direct encounter with the character of God, his majesty, his control, his mystery, and the quiet beauty of faith that survives without needing every answer. Job's outward life was restored, but far more than that, his heart was changed. He didn't just get back what he lost. He gained something entirely new. The story ends with peace, but not the kind Job had at the beginning. Before he was upright and blessed. Now he was upright and refined. Then he had heard of God. Now he had truly seen him. And that is the highest reward anyone can receive. We've come to the end of Job's journey, one of the most profound, mysterious, and soul-shaping stories in all of Scripture. A path carved by loss, silence, searching, and finally, an unshakable encounter with the God who speaks from the whirlwind. What do we carry with us as we close our eyes and reflect on all that Job endured? We carry this truth, that real faith doesn't need every answer. Yes, Job longed to understand. He cried out for reasons. He felt abandoned, misjudged, misunderstood. But God never condemned him for it. God listened. And at the right moment, God responded, not with explanations, but with presence. The greatest truth revealed was not why, but who. This was the hidden secret of Job. What God said from the storm wasn't some code or heavenly formula. It was a reminder. God remains who He is, even when the ground disappears beneath our feet, even when His voice goes quiet. Job teaches us that suffering doesn't always follow logic. It doesn't always have a visible cause. But it is never outside the reach of God. There is a purpose even when we can't see it. Sometimes it's the pain itself that becomes the furnace where faith is refined. We see this when Job, in the darkest moment of his life, still worshipped. When he tore his robe, sat in ashes and said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." We see it when he refused to curse God, even when his body was broken and his soul crushed. Shall we accept good from God and not also accept hardship? We see it when, despite being wounded by his friends, he prayed for them, and in that act of grace, restoration began. In the end, Job's greatest victory wasn't in getting back what he lost. It was what changed inside him. A heart humbled before greatness, a soul in awe of the divine mystery. And this is what stays with us when life begins to fall apart, that God is still in control. Even when heaven is silent, He sees us. When the whirlwind rises, it is there, in the storm, that His voice is heard. The secret of Job was never hidden. It was revealed one moment at a time through pain, tears, and endurance, until at the peak of it all God showed us. What matters most isn't having all the answers. It's learning to trust. Because when we trust, even in the dark, even when confused, the whirlwind stops being a symbol of chaos and becomes the very place where God speaks. Maybe right now you feel like Job, surrounded by loss, questions, or long silences. But remember, God is still speaking. God is still reigning. God is still restoring, and even in the whirlwind, He is near. If this story spoke to your heart, 2 more videos will appear on screen, featuring others in the Bible who walked through deserts and discovered divine truth. Click to watch, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and may God speak to you, even if it's from within the whirlwind.